served over 100 EdTech companies in the past decade to help them reach their next level of commercialization, realization, and success. And these include companies focused on classroom-based technologies, STEM 100 EdTech companies, virtual learning, and more, to help them reach their. So far as the agenda is concerned, we will begin with a keynote address on the role of education in community transformation. We all know, emerging from this pandemic, the issues of equity, access, learning, methodologies have gone through a significant change or changes. Following the keynote address, which will seek to highlight some of those issues, we will then have a short innovation showcase profiling a few companies that we either worked with or have been engaged with for this particular event, including 7th Generation Games, Be a Maker Club, Immersed Games, and the National Center for Rural School Mental Health. And we will highlight their work in providing them an opportunity to talk about their innovations. We will end with a panel of experts led by Larta board member Caprice Young, discussing the impacts of rural and underserved community education development and its implications for companies like the ones that we've showcased in our showcase today.
After this event, please make sure to check the official Ed Games Expo website for more information on the lineup of events across this week. Thank you and enjoy the show.
Our innovation showcase begins with a keynote address on the role of education in community transformation by Dr. Caprice Young, Larta Institute board member, National Superintendent of Lifelong Learning, previously elected Los Angeles Unified School District president, and founding CEO of the California Charter Schools Association. Welcome, Dr. Young.
I'm so pleased to be with you here today at Ed Expo. It's a real honor to be able to get some important ideas on the table, and especially to talk about the transformation that happens in communities when education is done well. And actually, what I really want to start with is a plain old truth that not a lot of people think about. But education, and specifically our schools, are really at the heart of all of our communities. And I think, as an example, I want to go back to my childhood. I was a generation that got bused from outside of our neighborhoods to magnet schools. And actually, in the early 80s, there was a process called desegregation where students from historically underserved communities, Black and brown kids, were often bused into the white neighborhoods. And of course, that busing took place because there was a belief that if the Black and brown students were sent to the white schools, that those were the good schools because the test scores were higher, or the student achievement as it was measured then, which had more to do with graduation, was higher, and that would equalize education. But often what happened in those circumstances was that students would be bused an hour across town to a neighborhood they didn't know, and thrust into a situation that was heavily racist, or if not racist, at least a context in which the students and the teachers around them didn't understand their own context. They didn't understand the strengths that kids from outside of those neighborhoods brought to the table, and made assumptions about their abilities that were often incorrect. It made it very difficult for the parents of the students who were bused in to go to family nights, to go to student events, to go to football games, to go to science fairs, to meet with the teachers. Instead of understanding that challenge, in most cases, what happened was that the people on those school sites assumed that those families were negligent, as opposed to that there were structural barriers put up in place. And then what also happened in those situations is that because students were being bused out of their own community every day, the investments in the schools within those communities were not being made in ways that were fair to the community. And so families really lost this sense of a neighborhood school being the center of their community. And that has become especially clear in the context of what we're seeing with the pandemic. So let me give you some examples. Before the pandemic, an organization called Measure of America was studying the percentage of our 16 to 24-year-olds who have dropped out of high school or been pushed out of high school and don't have jobs. Now, the last numbers that they have officially, and I'll go to these charts in a minute, showed that 11.2% of that demographic across the United States had not graduated from high school and didn't have jobs. These were our disconnected youth, and it's more than 4.5 million young people. But that was in 2018. Since the pandemic, the numbers are much higher, and Measure of America is saying that it's now at least 25% of those youth. It's also true that in rural areas and for Black and Brown and Native American students, the numbers were already much higher to begin with, and they are even higher now. So we are seeing, just in terms of graduation rates, tremendous inequities. And there are some really simple, obvious solutions to these problems when you look at it from the perspective of the young person. So I'm going to pause for a second and just show you those graphs. Right, what I'm showing you now actually is the youth disconnection that is straight off of the Measure of America website. So I urge you to go and take a look at the data that they share. But basically what you can see here is that in 2008, 12.6% of the young people between the ages of 16 and 24 were not in school, hadn't graduated, and were not working, right? And you could see those numbers rise up to nearly 15% over the course of the recession. And then by 2018, we had actually gotten it down to 11.2%. Now, 11.2% is still about 4.5 million young people. So it's not a small amount, but we had made real progress. Now the numbers have jumped up tremendously. We know that that number is well over 25% now, just based on looking at preliminary 2020 numbers. So it's a real cause for concern. But probably the bigger cause for concern is also that the metro areas and the rural areas are having real differences. So the metro areas, and this is a map that's showing the same numbers, but by metro area, those metro areas are having very high numbers, but the numbers in our rural and rural adjacent locations are the highest. So even back in 2018, the most disconnected neighborhoods in the United States were in Bakersfield, California. And when 20.8% of your young people didn't graduate from high school and are out of work, that is having a huge impact on the community. It's tremendous. So what those numbers are showing is that we have a real challenge in the United States around youth disconnection. We have got to keep the progress going on graduation that we had going into the pandemic. And that means going back and re-engaging young people. And that means addressing some of the really huge equity issues that we discovered or that came to light or people finally accepted in the context of the pandemic. One of those is technology and infrastructure. There's a huge discrepancy between kids who have access to technology and those who don't. So the students that I lead in the schools that I'm running, we have about 27,000 students, and our students are based in cities and rural areas throughout California, Ohio, and Michigan. And those students are primarily students who have dropped out. And we've been able to coax them back to school and get them re-engaged. And prior to the pandemic, 90% of our students would either graduate with us, or about a third of them would get back on track and rematriculate into their high schools. We did that with face-to-face tutoring, small group instruction, we're called a non-classroom based set of schools, but the truth is it's actually very, very in person. It's just that the students are getting one-on-one attention instead of learning in classrooms. So when the pandemic happened on March 13th of 2020, the first thing that we had to do was to get laptops out into the field. So we were able to issue 23,500 laptops within 3 weeks. But we quickly found we had a different problem, and that was that without Wi-Fi, those laptops were basically paperweights. And our kids didn't need paperweights. They needed to be connected. And so we bought 18,500 hotspots and got those out into the field. But one of the things that school districts often did to figure out who needed Wi-Fi and who didn't was they would email, and whoever emailed back and said, yeah, we need Wi-Fi, they would get them hotspots. Well, obviously, folks that don't have access to hotspots are going to have a lot more difficult time getting an email. So some school districts and schools also did things like texting, because what we find is families that don't have laptops often still have smartphones. For our students, we got on the phone and we called them. We sent people to their homes with masks to visit, to make sure that all of the technology got into their hands. But most of all, what we did was we decided to look at the data of their behavior instead of just asking. We said, okay, who's not turning in any work remotely? And who's eligible for Title I, which is a measure of poverty. And we just automatically gave hotspots to all of those students. That worked really well, except for the 3,000 students that we had in rural or very urban areas where even a hotspot wouldn't help them because they didn't have access to Wi-Fi. And in those cases, we had to do other solutions. And in many cases, it meant keeping our schools open so they could still come in, but then teaching them in a socially distanced way so that we could address all of the pandemic concerns. And this was especially important with our students because our students are disproportionately poor, they're disproportionately historically underserved, and Black and brown, and special ed. We have twice the percentage of special ed. We have many more English language learners, and 2,800 of our students are actually parents themselves. So we had to really, really look at what was going on in a detailed way in order to bridge those equity gaps. And I think that is what schools and school districts all across the country have to be thinking about now. It's not just how do we convince students to go back to the same way of doing things, it's how do we change what we're doing to meet the needs of our students. Another issue that is absolutely critical to that is mental health. We saw student mental health just plummet. We saw a huge increase in the suicides. We saw a huge increase in depression. We saw a huge increase in reports of family violence. And it was getting better before, but now it's getting worse. And so we really have to, again, go back to the idea that our schools are our centers of community, that our schools can be places of transformation and bring that mental health, the mental health service to our students. And that is especially true in rural areas. And one of the exciting things I think that we're seeing is the technology and the partnerships between universities and experts and rural schools to be able to use the tools of technology now that we're getting them into students' hands to be able to monitor and to address the mental health issues of our kids. Sort of like, there's been a revolution in the healthcare industry with the use of telemedicine. And I don't think that a lot of people are going to want to get rid of telemedicine because it has opened up brand new ways for families to get access to high quality care, especially not just for parents in rural areas, but for parents who are transit dependent or who need to stay home because they're caring for loved ones. And So in the same way as we've seen this increase in telemedicine, actually having this infusion of technology into schools is huge, absolutely huge. And it's gonna be transformative, I think, not just for the schools, but for the communities in which our schools are located. Most of all, what I'm hoping comes out of the pandemic is a shift from adult and school-focused learning to student-centered learning. So student-centered learning is where the students are involved in their learning, where they're making choices about what projects they're going to do to prove what they've learned or to discover something new. And what we find when we have student-centered learning is that there's an increase in curiosity, there's an increase in student engagement. We see students more involved in civic activities. They become more entrepreneurial. And it's those skill sets that come with critical thinking that are going to be the skill sets that those students need right now to get those great jobs. But more than that, student-centered learning is also about changing the structures of our schools to use the technology and also to use what we've learned about engagement. Remote learning gave our high school students the opportunity to condense the amount of time that it takes to do their required work and then take action on things that are their interests or their responsibilities. So in a pre-pandemic school day, a student would arrive at school around 8 o'clock, maybe a little bit earlier, maybe a little bit later, depending on the school, and not leave until 3. And maybe they'd have some after-school activities, but not so much because a lot of those have been curtailed given the recession that we just went through. And so they've got a full 7 hours where they're really only doing about 3 or 4 hours worth of work. So what the students have discovered now is that they can actually get their work done in 3 or 4 hours and then have another 3 or 4 hours to do things like create their own app, participate in community volunteering, take care of their brothers and sisters, or help their family to be able to earn a living. And those are the kinds of things that we need to find ways to continue to support, because those are the kinds of experiences that students need to be able to have to grow up to be healthy, happy human beings that can function in our society. So what I'd like to leave you with is just this, and that is that schools are always our centers of community. Schools are always the transformation driver in our communities. And the challenge for us is to make sure that those drivers are positive drivers, not negative drivers, that those are drivers that lead to student empowerment and teacher professional empowerment so that our society can benefit from all of these wonderful lessons that we've learned during the pandemic. Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be able to talk with you.
Thank you, Dr. Young, for this wonderful talk. In this next section of the Innovation Showcase, we will feature 4 innovative education technologies that are bridging the education equity gap for rural and underserved communities using various approaches and technologies.
Hi, I'm Wendy Rinke. I'm from the University of Missouri, and I'm happy to be here today at the Showcase event at the Games Expo 2021. I'm here to talk about the National Center for Rural School Mental Health. This is a center funded by the U.S. Department of Education, Institute of Education Sciences, and it's a collaboration across the Universities of Missouri, University of Virginia, and University of Montana. So we're across 3 states. And it's a 5-year project to develop a comprehensive model to identify, prevent, and intervene in youth mental health concerns in our rural school settings. One thing that we know is that 20% of school-age children experience serious mental health issues, yet very few of them receive services. And this is a situation that is exacerbated in rural settings due mostly to the limited resource or access to mental health services for youth and families in rural settings. So working with schools where we know the majority of youth are on a daily basis to have tools and interventions to intervene with mental health will increase access for these students who otherwise would not receive care. So part of the center is really helping schools to identify students. So we have a universal social emotional screening system we call the early identification system that has both a student version and a teacher version. So here you see a version of what students see when they go online to take the assessment. So students in grades 3 through 12 take the assessment up to 3 times a year. And it's very user-friendly, very easy for them to complete. It takes about 10 to 15 minutes. And here's an example of our teacher version in which teachers in grades kindergarten through 12th grade take this up to 3 times a year. It self-populates. The assessment has a self-population of their student names in their classroom across the top. Those names are all fake for this. And then going down the side are different risk indicators, and teachers can quickly just check the boxes for the students who have those risk indicators. It's really easy, it's really simple for them. They really like it, and it takes about 10 minutes up to 30 minutes depending on the size of their classroom. Now the domains that the early identification system are giving us data back on are these 7 different areas. These are areas that we know if we don't intervene and students have risk in those areas, they have the likelihood of developing later and more long-term mental health issues. So the areas of focus are attention and academic issues, peer relationship problems, externalizing behavior problems, which are like aggressive acting out behaviors, internalizing behaviors, which are symptoms of depression or anxiety, emotion dysregulation, school disengagement, and bullying behaviors. And importantly, these are all malleable, meaning that if we intervene with them, we can actually change that negative trajectory. So finding students early in these areas is very important. So now once schools complete their cycle and they close out the assessments, there's a dashboard that auto-populates reports that we've created in ways that we think schools will find very user-friendly. So we use a red, yellow, green format, red meaning that it's an area that needs attention, yellow means that there's some risk there, and if it's green, it's actually more of a protective factor for the school. Now, this is an example of a school level report, so all the data is aggregated at the school level. And what we tell schools is that if you have areas where 20% or more of your students are demonstrating risk in this area, rather than intervening one student at a time, it makes more sense to think about more universal preventive efforts. So if you're in a school and 20% or more of your students have attention and academic issues, it's a lot better use of resources if you do something that's intervening school-wide for that particular domain, simply because you'll reach more students. So there's school level reports, we have grade level reports, and we also go down to individual reports. So again, this is a made up name, but this would be a student level report. And on one side is the teacher checklist, on the other side is the student survey across those same domains. So you can quickly look to see where there's areas of risk that might need attention or that have low risk or no risk at all. So then schools use these reports and problem solving teams. And then based on what the data looks like, they can go into what we've developed here. We're calling it the Early Identification System Intervention Hub. This is on our website, so schools can go in. If they have an area, let's say the area of concern is externalizing behaviors. They simply click on externalizing behaviors. It opens up a series of questions. Are you in elementary, middle school, high school? Are you looking for a universal prevention, a group-based intervention, or individual intervention for students? And it populates a menu of options that the schools can then choose from based on their needs. And it provides access to tell them exactly how to do that intervention in their school setting. So this is a 5-year project. We are rolling into year 3. So next fall, we will be doing a feasibility test with 30 rural schools, meaning that we're going to roll out our tools and this model into 30 different schools who we're partnering with. They're going to give us feedback as our school partners, and we're going to adapt based on their feedback for the year 4 and 5, where we evaluate the full model with 110 rural schools. So with regard to that, we have these tools. I think sort of the next steps are developing professional development modules, ways to provide coaching to schools on the use of these systems. But that's the National Center for Rural School Mental Health. Thanks for having me.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Trofe, founder and CEO of Immersed Games. We have a team based out of Buffalo, New York, and we build middle school science games. I'll tell you about in a little bit. Diversity and equity are extremely important to our team, and actually we serve 10% more BIPOC students than the national average, working especially in the area around us in Buffalo and in Washington, where we have more adoption in those areas. And we also, with equity being so important, have done a lot of work to ensure that our product works on Chromebooks, in the web browser, and are always working on making it work on lower and less reliable internet as well. But now let me tell you what I actually do and why that's really cool that we pulled that off. So our product, Tyto Online, empowers students to actually do science in a hands-on way. We use a video game to set that up. So let me show you how that works. First, we engage students. They, of course, love setting up their character that represents them in the game and going in to do various quests and activities. And we see that this engagement works, with 19% of students choosing to play extra content beyond what their teacher has assigned to them. And then we inspire with authentic problem solving. So for example, to learn about genetics, a councilwoman tells them there's going to be a food shortage. So they go work with a botanist, they look at cultivars, they learn about Punnett squares, and they run experiments on water levels and light levels in order to bring back to the councilwoman and say, basically what we should fund in order to help that out. And another example, we also set up real science phenomena. Rather than say just watching videos, they get to go experience it. So for example, and this is a real thing, they get to explore the zombie ants in the Amazon rainforest by going there. They explore the ant colony, collect data, and figure out what's going on after they see this ant die and fungus explode from its head. As one of our teachers said, we help create what real science is like by providing this direct experience versus relying on passive watching of videos or reading about it. We've been very lucky to be supported by both the National Science Foundation and the Department of Education with SBIR phase 1s and a phase 2 with the NSF. And we've seen through pilots that we've run with that we've had great pre-post success. What we love the most is with the NSF, we saw a 12% increase in science and engineering skills and practices, like their ability to analyze data and ask good questions. And this is for us what's so cool about what we've built and about what game-based learning can do. It's not just about content, but about that skill development, since you're able to go and do science, but in a video game. Which actually leads us to our last point. We, of course, support a lot of underrepresented students, but we also use a lot of strategies. Representation is important, and it's what generally gets discussed the most. And we do find it important to bust stereotypes about STEM and who participates in STEM. But beyond just who, it's also what it's like. The research shows that people tend to think that STEM careers are weird and they're people in lab coats by themselves. So we show that they're collaborative by having you go solve it in an online multiplayer game. We show the social impact of STEM. You're not just learning about pea plants for genetics, you're actually solving a food shortage by figuring out how to grow more crop. And these strategies are critical to helping students actually engage in STEM, and especially underrepresented students, to keep caring about it beyond middle school, which is where we focus on. Even further, what we've been doing lately is working in some anti-racist science content. Research shows that if you say, as part of teaching about genetics, introduce the idea that the fact that Black people in the US are more likely to have sickle cell anemia, that can accidentally reinforce racist misconceptions. And so what we've been doing is being very intentional about this as well. And we built a storyline recently about mutations that fits all the standards, but breaks that down and shows why people might have more likely chance to have a certain disease from different racial backgrounds, and that it also happens to white people and all sorts of different genetic backgrounds as well. So this has been really exciting for our team to spend more time not only supporting underrepresented students of all types, but making sure that we're adding in this content that's really giving us a strong background that we can support diversity and equity in many ways.
My name is Zev. I'm the founder of Beer Maker Club. I'm excited to be here at the Ed Games Expo 2021. We are building an online infrastructure for 3D printing. Our goal is to enable access to digital fabrication for everyone. Our online infrastructure eliminates the need for a user to buy equipment, allowing them to manufacture and fabricate on an on-demand basis. Using our custom video setup for live streaming, we deliver a digital experience that is close to an in-person experience. This makes it possible for learners to 3D print using just an internet connection, thus bridging the equity gap for rural and underserved communities. In addition to our online technology platform, we've also developed a unique pedagogical model that allows our students to learn CAD, computer-aided design, for 3D modeling without the steep learning curve. The social impact of our pedagogy has been externally validated, and 48% of our students are girls. This is far higher than any comparable STEM program today. 3D printing democratizes manufacturing and encourages grassroots entrepreneurship. This can have a significant impact in rural and underserved areas, allowing community members to develop solutions for local problems. We received in-kind funding from our local maker community, Claremont McKenna College, Harvey Mudd College, and Snap the Gap project. Pre-COVID, we generated enough revenue to fund our growth organically. Post-COVID, we want to raise funding to further build out our online technology platform and our remote print farm, adding printers just like this to increase our printing capacity. The key challenge we're facing right now is the lack of education-focused VC firms. Typically, they want us to demonstrate the same type of financial metrics as a consumer tech company, which is difficult for a socially focused company like ours. We want everyone to start using CAD to create their design. For this, we are building a low input design tool that a learner can start using without any technical training whatsoever. We are also building a self-service online fabrication management system that will bring the cost of production per piece down to cents on the dollar. Finally, we want to grow our team to include a full-time programmer who can focus on the iterative development of our platform. We also want to recruit an enthusiastic community manager and increase the capacity of our remote print farm by adding several more printers.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope you can make with us. We invite all communities to come and make at Be a Maker Club. You can contact us via our website, www.beamakerclub.com.
Thank you so much for having me here today at the Ed Games Expo. I'm Maria Burns-Ortiz, co-founder and CEO of 7th Generation Games, where we make educational video games and interactive apps aimed at closing the math gap in underserved communities. We teach math in context, applying real-world applications of math in a virtual world, incorporating elements of language arts and drawing from diverse histories, including from Indigenous and Latino cultures, because we believe all children should see themselves in the curriculum they're taught and the games they play. Tackling the equity gap is at the center of everything we do at 7th Generation Games. With our focus on serving Indigenous communities, Latino communities, and rural communities, schools and students too often overlooked, at best underserved by the vast majority of EdTech solutions. We know that no matter how incredible your learning software is, kids can't learn from a game they can't access, which is why our games are developed to run in the most remote and low resource settings, compatible with low cost hardware and with offline options for when internet access is unreliable or unavailable. But access takes many forms. We make games where language of instruction, audio, video, and text can be flipped between on every screen to provide inclusive, effective, and engaging resources for English language learners. We know attracting and retaining highly qualified teachers is a struggle for many communities we're in, which is why we launched the USDA-funded Growing Math Project to provide teacher training, performance data, and classroom-ready lesson plans and resources to supplement our games. While there's still work to do, we're proud of the results we've been able to help kids achieve. Across multiple years of efficacy data, kids who played our games for 10 weeks saw 30% improvement on the math skills covered in them pre to post test, which was 3x better than the control group. And that's important because no matter how cool your game is, it only matters if kids are actually learning from it. Even before the last year and a half, the digital divide was too wide for too many. In many homes, the only internet access kids might have was through a parent's Android smartphone cellular data. The pandemic had made it impossible to ignore the disparities that exist when it comes to education and access for too many US learners, disproportionately students of color and in rural areas. We work with a tribal school district where 34% of the kids have no home internet access. And because our solutions run under these conditions, we were one of the few educational software options available to their students. At a time when solutions were most needed, we had one available. And I'm excited about what we have coming next. We're creating games with a tribe in Oregon to teach math and cultural history that will be bilingual in their language, which has been declared recently extinct, leveraging our technology to assist in their efforts to keep their language from being truly lost. We're developing a bilingual game to teach math and Navajo culture in the Dene language to be able to serve students in one of the most remote areas in this country and one of those most ravaged by COVID-19. We're continuing to expand our line of English-Spanish bilingual games to best serve those learners because we don't want language barriers to also be barriers to learning math. And when I say equity is at the core of our company, I mean that in every way, including that 80% of our staff identify as Latino, Indigenous, or Black. We come from the communities that we serve. We know that education provided us the foundation to both achieve the work we're doing today and the transformative impact it can have. And at 7th Generation Games, we believe every child should have that same opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you to our participating innovators. We have assembled a reflection panel to discuss the impacts of rural and underserved community education development. Returning to moderate is our keynote speaker and Larta Board of Directors member, Dr. Caprice Young, speaking with panelists Dr. Suzanne Sluka, USDA NIFA Division Director, Family and Consumer Sciences, Youth, and 4-H, and Dr. Alan Pratt, Executive Director of the National Rural Education Association.
My name is Dr. Caprice Young, and I am so pleased to be facilitating this discussion. Here's the thing, everybody. We wanted to make sure that we had practitioners who are on the ground doing the work with young people and with professionals every single day. So we have this panel where we're very, very lucky to have Dr. Suzanne Sulka and Dr. Alan Pratt with us, who are living this every single day. And I'm going to ask Dr. Pratt, give us a little bit about your background and all of those schools and school districts that you work with.
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's exciting to get to talk about the rural context and what it means to us in general, but to really educate people on why rural is so important for our country. And so that's why I'm excited to be here. This is my 26th year in education. It may be 28. I might have lost 2 years somewhere, just mentally dealing with middle school 2 students or something. But I've been a principal, science teacher, vocational teacher, worked for the State Department. I've been an assistant superintendent, and now I'm in my current role based at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, but main job is the executive director of the National Rural Education Association. We represent members in all 50 states. We have 43 state affiliates, and pretty much if you can think about a rural area, we have a school district or a person in that school district that's connected with us somehow or with their state affiliate. We have, obviously, if you look, we have membership base from Maine to San Diego. So it's a pretty interesting swath of land that we cover, and it's just really excited to be here.
That's so great. We are blessed to have you here. And Dr. Suzanne Slka, tell us about what you do. You've got a cool job.
Thank you. So I am with United States Department of Ag, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and I oversee the divisions of Family and Consumer Sciences, which really encompass a lot of work on community and economic development, family well-being, health, all those things that impact those rural communities. And then I also get to oversee the division of youth and 4-H. And so 4-H is one of the largest positive youth development organizations in the nation. And so I hope to look forward to talking more about that a little bit more here in the future. But I also come from 15 plus years of being at land grant universities where I worked for the Cooperative Extension Service and on the ground with a lot of rural communities and primarily tribal communities. So again, excited to bring some of those experiences to all of you today.
That's great. Well, let me start with you then. What are some of the projects that you are working on right now that you're excited about?
So with USDA NIFA, some of the things that really particularly tie in here is that you all will have heard about the 7th generation games. And so that was an SBIR, small business funded project. And so we have held our panels and we have the first phase of a few more of projects along those same lines that are really looking to help rural communities. And so I can bring up some of those examples later. I'll just do an overview here now. But things that are like managerial aspects for those rural communities, and so that we've given out the phase 1. Some other things that we're also really looking at along the 4-H and youth development side is when COVID hit, we also, like many schools, had to adjust. And so we have been looking at different ways of engaging youth that are perhaps non-traditional ways. And so I can get, again, more in depth in that, but we launched through the National 4-H Council, 4-H at home aspect. So really trying to reach youth when they were at home. And I'll bring more news on that a little bit later.
No problem. I want to continue though on that. When you think about what you've learned in the field over the years, what are some of the gaps that you've seen, projects that you would like to have seen funded or that you're hoping will be created in the future?
So we at NIFA are always listening to the stakeholders and asking, what are those gaps? What do the communities really need? And one area that we found, and so we launched funding, the applications just closed in May, but we also took a look and said, there's a gap in this non-formal education route. And especially technologies related to ag literacy. So we're really excited, again, that closed in May, but we're calling it our Food and Agriculture Non-Formal Education Initiative. And it's really about asking applicants to apply to talk about new technologies and create new technologies to engage youth. And one specific piece that I think a lot of us forget about is that youth engagement piece or youth voice. And so what they had to also do was to think about how and articulate to the reviewers how that youth voice is being used to create these technologies, not just at the end, but throughout the entire process. And so we're really excited to launch some new non-formal education with technology aspects.
I think that is so cool because what I've seen from students and what I've heard directly from students since the pandemic has been that they actually really liked distance-based education because they could get their work done much faster because there's no passing periods, there's no lunch, there's no going to and from. And then they were able to spend more time on their own personal projects, whether it was taking care of their animals or growing things in their garden or starting new projects or taking care of their siblings and family. So I'm excited to hear more about that. So Dr. Pratt, you're not off the hook. You're out there working with the thousands of school districts that are dealing with all of the challenges of being rural school districts, but also all of the, in some ways, advantages. What projects are a priority for you?
But I think to bring up the point that you both made at the end of the current conversation was the fact of how students engaged during the pandemic, as far as learning and being more individualized. So one of the things that we're promoting and pushing right now is this innovative kind of keepsake, in the sense of what we don't want to go back to I guess the old normal. We want to make sure we're with the new normal. And we proved quickly that we don't need and when I say this, I'm going to preface this with, I'm not saying brick and mortar buildings are bad. Trust me. I think going to school is a great deal, and socialization and all that good stuff. But we proved that we don't have to be in the building 5 days a week to learn and to engage and be innovative and do great things. And our students can really do a great job, which connects to really workforce development and mentorship programs and different things going on in rural communities. So that's one of the things we're pushing, is the future of rural, and how we need to keep moving forward and take the hybrid, blended, and distance remote learning and use it to our best advantage, either from the sense of doing traditional school part-time and doing a remote learning process, to doing all different kind of creative ways to offer courses that maybe schools in rural, remote, say Montana, can't offer to all their students, but now can with the technology that we have. That's one aspect that we're working on. The other aspect is continuing our third year in I Am a Rural Teacher project, which started really before the pandemic. And we were highlighting stories of why it's important to be a rural teacher. And during the pandemic, it turned into what are we doing daily to support our students, and what's it actually like in your community dealing with the pandemic day to day. We found great stories from California to New York on the teachers going above and beyond, which we knew that was the case. They do that every year and every day. And then we're happy to say that we're funded another year to do that work with the Rural Schools Collaborative, and there'll be more stories coming out, and we're excited about that work. And the third part that we're working on right now is our conference. And our conference is in the fall of November, and we're going to take the approach that we're preaching to schools, that we're going to be hybrid and face-to-face at our conference. So we're going to offer a virtual component, on-demand library of presentations, but also a face-to-face approach. And I think that's kind of, that's our three big buckets. Obviously, broadband is tied into all of those buckets. And we've been doing a lot of work with T-Mobile, doing a lot of work with other companies and electric co-ops to provide services for rural communities and to connect those students. So that's a lot I said, that I added, but we got a lot going on. So
you're really busy. Both of you are really, really, really busy, and doing really cool kinds of things. What are some of the things that you learned during the pandemic about what works and what doesn't work?
I'm a real positive person, so I'm going to take the positives out of what I learned on the positive side. I learned that we are very creative folks in the rural communities. I learned that we can be adaptive and change and do things to really help our community, and we can pull together when we need to. That's all positive. Now let's talk about the negative side. I'm starting to see coming out of this pandemic a little bit that we're shifting towards what we used to be, and shifting towards technology was great. We used it. We're still going to use it a little bit, but we're going to go back to face-to-face. So I don't want to lose that capability. And I think that's what's kind of worrying me as we move forward. Obvious answer to the pandemic and what we learned is that we have major inequities, and we have major areas of our country that don't have access, that the healthcare issues in those communities, underserved youth in the sense of really access to adequate services in general. And that really was, we knew there was an issue, but I think seeing it during this stressful time in our country and seeing the division that we have in our country, it brings a lot to the forefront that we need to work on, we need to address.
Absolutely. Thank you. Dr. Shukla, what have you learned and what are you seeing?
Yeah. So the positives is that we really pulled together, and people across the nation got innovative and creative and in a time of challenge. And so they came up with new ways to, like in our 4-H programs, how do you use Facebook and the live platforms to hold a 4-H meeting, to engage them in their next project they're learning, to social media things. I think maybe we were a little maybe held back or afraid to do, and then we were just, I hate to say forced, but kind of forced. And then it wasn't so scary, right? And some really beautiful things and partnerships, like Dr. Pratt mentioned, have emerged for us as well. I also think we discovered the inequities too. And I think, as you heard, the administration priorities are about broadband. So, as an agency looking at how we can support broadband initiatives and again, engaging our cooperative extension system across the nation to say, how can we step up at the beginning of the pandemic, extension offices, because they had probably in some of these rural communities the most reliable Wi-Fi, were allowing students and people to tap into them, come into their parking lot and sit and engage that Wi-Fi. And so that's grown as a model, but we need to now grow that access. And so we're looking at funding opportunities that we can use to help support that. I just took some notes too, and I think, as a whole, all of us as a workforce, how do we engage and especially think about future workforces that we're creating, that all of their onboarding might be virtual, and that's a different perspective too. And so I've never met any of my staff in person because I joined completely during the pandemic. So as we as an organization think about how we can make an impact on that future workforce, how do we pivot towards that too?
That's exciting and interesting. You touched on one thing, and that was funding. Now we've got this flood of funding coming from the federal government right now. And as educators, we're all super excited about this. Just to give you a sense of how much money that is. I live in Los Angeles, and in Los Angeles, the annual amount of money that we get from all sources is about $16,000 per pupil. Now, the amount that we're getting just in this one rush of funding is $14,000 per pupil. So the question is, how do we use that money well? And how do we find long-term strategies to sustain the things that we invest in now, so there's not just a cliff in 2024 when the money runs out?
Let me jump on that one. I just left a call with the president's budget submission that came out probably an hour ago. So part of what you're talking about, and with not special needs students, but also Title I schools, the funding is going to be increased with the 2022 budget. We know what we've seen come through with ESSER funds and what's happening. I'm going to be honest with you, and I'm going to put the old superintendent kind of work hat on here. When districts had a good setup and a good plan of action moving forward, federal stimulus money was easy to place, use, and grow your school system. When you are shooting like a shotgun approach to solve problems and you're scattering all over the place, the money is going to go scattered, and it's not going to go, and it's not going to sustain, I think you said long-term work. It's not going to happen. We know that going into it. When it was announced that the funding was passed and everyone was real excited, my stomach sank, because I knew places that this money was going to be like pouring water down the drain. I mean, because it's going to happen that way because they're not prepared. Part of our job and what we've been doing is trying to help districts plan, but also connect them with high quality people that can help them direct the funding. And they've been bombarded with vendors right now, and that's great because vendors need to make money as well. I can
tell you, I get a zillion emails a day. I have superintendent in my title, and
I know, and it's good. I mean, because we want people to make money, we want their companies to thrive, and all that good stuff. One of the things that we are able to do is that when we partner or work work with a group, we make sure we vet them with our board, and we vet them through kind of the eye test and the smell test, if that makes sense, on if they're good. And we found a lot of good companies that are willing to work and do what's right for rural students and rural communities. And it goes back to the innovative piece that, don't buy devices just to buy devices. Buy devices to help your students. Buy programs or invest the money in really emotional support, staffing, or whatever it may be, what you need. And we really, I go back to your first question about what we learned during the pandemic. I learned that regionalism is very important, and being a regional group and being together and being cooperative helps. And I think, and I know I'm rambling, but still, it's very important. And we got one shot here. And if we mess it up, I think we could be playing in the hands of people that want to privatize education in some sense. So that's my take.
I'm very hopeful that the educators are going to get it right. What's your take on that, Dr. Shukla? We've got a lot of money coming forward to the school districts, that most of whom also had financial challenges going into it, and the money is very, very categorized, right? So what's your advice about how to do it well?
Right. Well, we're holding the same kind of meetings, both internally with our staff, going, we don't want this to run out or this good work to stop in a couple of years. But we also are, listening to our stakeholders. And I'm going to go back to something I think you said right away, Caprice, Dr. Young, is that, are we listening to the community? And again, I'm coming from that community-based perspective. And sometimes I do, I'm not sure if schools go back out into the community and just say as a whole and ask for that help and see, is there something else out in that community? And that's what rural communities, that's why I loved growing up in a rural community. They all want to help, and they all have that passion, and so they have the ideas out there too. And so I guess from our standpoint, it's really about listening and then building capacity. And so one more area I'll mention is that we are taking a look and saying, are we building capacity at minority serving institutions, like our Hispanic serving institutions, our historically Black colleges and universities, our tribal 1994 colleges and universities? So also look at that community and just see if perhaps outside of the school walls, if that's where they're receiving the funding, if somebody else can be brought in to help.
That makes so much sense, and I talk to other superintendents around the country who are all being sort of bombarded by vendors right now, and it's really difficult sometimes to know, where are those little pots of excellence that we can implement. And it's often so hard to just figure out how to squeeze in something that's innovative, because school districts are just, we get in our ways, we get set in our ways, and we just do it and do it and do it and do it. And sometimes you get those little innovative pieces and it's hard to integrate them. But now we've had this huge disruption, right? And there are people with awesome ideas and wonderful tools out there, both inside of our schools and coming from vendors. And then there is a question about, how do we make sure that we can get the chocolate and the peanut butter together, right? If I'm dating myself with the old peanut butter cup commercials. and so I'm really curious, what can we do to connect innovators and school districts? But I want to be careful to say that we also have innovators in our school districts who want certain things. So getting the ideas out of the school districts and communities to find innovators who may not know that that's needed. How do we get the chocolate and peanut butter together?
In a lot of areas, again, in every single state, you've got services like Extension that really do facilitation as well. And so have schools thought about bringing them in and just facilitating these conversations? And again, what we've really been looking at nationwide is also incorporating that youth voice So are you having meetings at noon when they can sit over lunch and the youth can contribute? Same time, the teacher, again, I've been out of school for a while, or when is it that we can have these conversations and have the people at the table that can innovate, like you said, both inside and outside, but there might be some facilitators that you just didn't recognize right there in your own community down the street that could lead these conversations.
Dr. Pratt?
Yeah, I think that that's a good point about, all stakeholders in the community need to be involved. I think coming out of the pandemic, we involved a lot of stakeholders, so we need to keep that momentum going and moving forward. I will say peanut butter to chocolate or chocolate to peanut butter. I will say you need a vanilla wafer in there every once in a while, and I think vanilla wafer is going to be. I think it can be an ag extension office. I think it can be someone, a workforce or an industry in the regional area. And I'm going to say this, and I don't want to be taken the wrong way. Sometimes we need less up from the top down, meaning state government and federal government, just to let people work and work it out regionally. This is a golden opportunity because we have been crazy shifted around. So why would we want to go back to the constraints we had before when we prove we don't need them all the time? Okay, so this is our opportunity. This is the one shot, and I think President Biden said it. He said this is our moonshot, kind of for this generation in education. If we don't do this the right way, it's going to come back to haunt us, and that's my fear.
Yeah.
But I will say, I think rural America can prosper in the sense of with the proper broadband connectivity that we can have people work from home. We can have people move into our regions. We can have tourism. We can have economic development. We can have all kind of innovative jobs that we don't even know exist, but there's a third grader in one of our schools right now that's going to create it. So, I mean, all that's going to happen. And I think we can be at the forefront and really, really help our country out tremendously. And that's kind of, I try to be positive about it, but I know, my time doing this job and my time in education is probably down to 5 or 6 years and I can retire. I'm not going to get out of it totally, but I want these 5 or 6 to be moving in the right direction. And I want this to not be something we deal with again. So.
Yeah. Well, I spent 4 years as president of the Los Angeles School District Board. Actually 4 years on the board too as president, and after that got into the charter school movement in California, which is all public, it's all nonprofit. And the thing that really drew me to that was that the laws for charter schools gave us much more flexibility, a lot more flexibility, so we could do these kinds of creative things. And I'm seeing a lot across the country of people in the traditional public schools saying, we want that also. We want to be able to have that flexibility too. But then there are other voices that are saying, wow, we don't want you to have that flexibility because you're going to screw it up. And we want to tell you what to do, even though we're not the ones on the ground doing it. As you think about both of your experiences working with schools, what freedoms would you want to have in traditional public schools and in other government partnership contexts to be able to have the nimbleness that you need to meet your community's needs?
I want everything you just described. I'm serious. I mean, I think you hit it, nimbleness to make it happen, and the ability to say, I'm in Southeast Tennessee. We have Volkswagen here. We have other tier 2 providers for our Volkswagen factory. Schools could not change rapidly to address the workforce needs that they needed immediately. It took a year to 2-year process. Well, why couldn't we have 6 months to make that transition? Why can't we have that flexibility to say, okay, so you need trained logistic workers, and we're going to shift this stuff around. You'll have them in a year and a half, 18 months. Why can't? That's what we need to have, and that's what's going to happen in rural America. So all the above, less less rules, less less paperwork, more regionalism, more taking care of our own. And what I mean by that, taking care of the workforce and the schools and making an environment where our students want to stay, because there's a lot of research out there saying kids want to flee and there's a brain drain. There's also a lot of research saying they would come back and stay if there was opportunity. So it's up to us to create those opportunities.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Shukla, you are renowned for being the person who can be that vanilla wafer and convene people, but also move the powers of the bureaucracy to get projects funded and to get the chocolate and peanut butter together. What's your secret?
I'm still learning. I'm still learning the secrets too. So, but you're right. We have a responsibility, right? To listen and to hear out and to listen to our stakeholders, and then to provide that funding that's going to meet their needs. And we need to be nimble and can do that. And I guess I'm really proud of NIFA and USDA because I think we do that. We're taking a really hard look now at things that came down from the administration's priority, like racial equity. And again, when I talked about building that capacity to climate change and working with climate science and workforce and rural and broadband. So I guess, yeah, just continued listening. And then when we see that funding come down, how can we make sure that you know about it too, right, on the ground, so that you can solve your own schools can solve their own complex problems, and not necessarily us telling you what to do, that we can just create the platform and the funding to do it.
Hey, can I add something to what Suzanne just talked about? We actually ran a pilot program pre-pandemic and now in the pandemic using USDA dollars for training teachers to be career advising specialists in rural schools. And we created a micro-credential that's on Digital Promise right now. It's free to anyone who wants to use it and take it. But they created district and school plans on how to integrate industry data, labor market data into their normal classroom, so students as early as middle school could know, hey, there's 9 kind of jobs around me that I can make a livable wage and make a good money and go to trade school or go to a four-year school. And that's what USDA has been important to us. And I'm not doing a promo for you, but it has really been good. That's a connection point. And we knew it's easier to get money from the USDA than some of the other grants in the federal government. And what I mean by easier, they're easier to work with. The people at the USDA are easier to work with. So that's been our push. We started that program 2020. And 2019, 2020, and we're going to start another area. So we're applying for more money post-pandemic, doing the same thing. So yeah, that was my USDA promo video. You can save it.
Well, a lot of people don't know that the USDA is so involved in education.
Yeah.
Some people know that it's involved in the school lunch program, but that is kind of where it ends. But
Yeah.
But clearly there are a lot of really cool projects that you're working on and are moving through. What's the process for prioritizing the funding for projects?
Again, it depends on the language, that Congress writes into the legislation. Sometimes it's very specific and we have to carry that forward, but it's also, talking with them, interpreting that language, and then talking with the stakeholders and saying, okay, we just held like a listening session on a pot of money that came forward on a, Ag Center with historically Black colleges and universities. And so we received the kind of the charge, but we wanted to hear from them before we wrote the RFA, before we really looked at how that money should be utilized. So I think we do that to the extent possible. And then you're right, we try to, if we need to get it out the door quickly as we can, with our rules and procedures as well. But when like COVID hit, for example, we did some rapid response and millions of dollars. So like the 4-H program at home that I talked about, that was a $3 million grant because we knew it was potentially affecting, millions of children and at home with their families after school and still in the house needing some education.
Well, one of the things that I know education entrepreneurs struggle with is the fact that there are so many school districts. I mean, 19,000 school districts nationally, I think, was a number that I heard recently, and it's hard for education entrepreneurs to figure out how to market to them, how to get to know them, how to reach them, how to let them know what they're doing. Yeah, Dr. Pratt, what advice would you give to an education entrepreneur who thought they had the secret sauce and that you would buy something just because it's good? What would you tell them? How do you know that how do your superintendents want to be approached?
So this person, this entrepreneur, just needs to call me, and we can. Nah, seriously, I mean that's the connection point. It's about relationships in rural, and if they know you, they trust you, they'll work with you. And I think that's where USDA, NREA, the Rural Schools Collaborative we work with, and other organizations, we're that kind of buffer, and we're not the gatekeeper because those are more at the community level, but we are definitely someone that can get them to the gatekeeper to allow them to work with the schools or purchased items. The other thing is, I think rural communities like someone there for the long haul. So they if they're going to buy something from you, they want to know that you're going to have service, and they can pick up the phone or send an email, and you'll be able to answer their questions and connect with them. And it's not. And I've told companies that wanted to invest in our organization that we turned money away because they wanted this ROI that would be in 6 months. And I'm like, you're not going to get it in rural America. It's not going to be a 6-month turnaround. It's going to be a year. But when the turnaround happens, you're going to get more out of it than you would in that quick 6 months window that you're looking for. So it's a process, but it's all about relationships, period.
You got to invest in those relationships. Yeah. Dr. Slilka, what advice would you give to education entrepreneurs who want to serve the rural populations?
Yeah, relationships are so key. And if they can live there and live in the communities, and they'll understand the communities and what they need. Our small business, the SBIR program, that phase 1 is really good too for these entrepreneurs, because that gives them that little bump, okay, I want to pilot. I want to see if this is going to work. So maybe they don't have that relationship, but they can use this funding to develop and strengthen that relationship, kind of go through those bumps that happen in the road when you're developing that trust. And then they can go on for the larger dollars that come in phase 2 to really expand that work. So yeah, I think you have to get through those bumps and figure that out, and just see what that community wants and needs, because I know from working, I always had one vision, right, as kind of the educator, the researcher, but then listening to the community, you kind of end up over here with your new outcome. So that little bit of pilot is a good thing.
So I'd love to follow up on that, and I know we're getting close to the end, but what are examples of dream projects or great projects that already exist, or priorities that you want to advocate on behalf of? Dr. Pratt, you want to start?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, and I'm going to start it with a little story, okay? If you can bear with me, okay? I was in Montana, and I was getting a cup of coffee at a local not really a restaurant, but like a store, and I had a tie on. I was going to a meeting, and one of the farmers, ranchers, so to speak, came up and said, "Where are you from, son?" And I told him, and he said, "What do you do?" I said, "Well, I work in education funding." He goes, "If I gave you $30 million tomorrow, what are 3 things you're going to spend it on?" And I paused for a second. And he goes, "See, son, you can't pause. You got to have those 3 answers ready to go." So I'm going to say it like this. So I do have 3 answers, kind of. I think investing in ways to connect our K-12 to innovative training and jobs. And what I mean by that is, one way would be, if it's in the tech sector, there's a lot of middle school and high school students that can be call center folks, be call service, and help the older folks in the community learn their devices and learn how to connect on the internet and do things like filling out applications for healthcare and all that good stuff. So invest in those community projects that tag our high school and middle school students into work and work-based learning, and let them run. That's number one.
I love that.
Number two is an invest. I believe we have to invest in our teacher workforce and our pipeline, and we have to make it more of not the way it was, but more of a facilitator's role, and take an easy certification process for our teachers, meaning we don't have to go through this long way to be certified. We go through based on their experience, if they're a second career person, and give them a lot of credit for what they've done in their workforce and their work field, and let them be instructors and mentors to our students. And the third one, let's figure out the broadband stuff. It's going to take Fed, state, and local and regional. Let's get it done. This shouldn't be. We're in a major country in the world. We're leaders. We should not have broadband issues. Period. So that's my three.
Love it. Love it. Dr. Shukla, what are your three?
Oh, three. Well, I'll focus more on like talking about the SBIR program, just to give individuals a little bit more background and knowledge, and then tell you about one that we've recently funded as well. So as we heard, the 7th Generation Games actually came out of USDA NIFA funding. And I'd like to circle back on that because it has a cultural piece, and we haven't really talked about the cultural piece. So remind me if I don't circle back. But for instance, we do have what we call our SBIR topic area 8.6, which is rural and community development. So again, if entrepreneurs were looking to develop like a technology or a service, so Dr. Pratt, like you talked about, how do you pair older adults and youth with technologies and services? So if they had some ideas, this would be that pot of funding to apply to. And so it's really, how do we increase that human capital development? How do we increase jobs? And really with our most vulnerable populations in communities. And again, a vulnerable population can be, older adults, but it can also be, it can be youth. There's a lot of things that can be identified as that. It can be, food security, like we talked about as well. And so one of the ones that was just recently funded is funded by Parametric Studio, is who was awarded the grant. And they're going to really look at, we talked about STEM a little earlier, because they talk about 9 of the 10 fastest growing occupations really require that expertise in math and science. And so we're interested to see what this pilot project does, but what they're going to do is they're going to help students use the engineering and simulation tools to design, analyze, and solve design project problems. And here's the key: relevant to their communities. So they want to tap in and not lose that rural STEM brain drain. They want to keep them there, and they want to give them and increase their mathematics and engineering skills while also teaching them to stay in the community, talk to the community, make some change in your community as well. So circling back though, to hearing Maria Ortiz talk about the 7th Generation Games, that's really important, and that language literacy and that connection to STEM too. In rural communities, we have a lot of tribes that live in this rural land, in this rural area. And so how are we helping to preserve language and working, again, connecting that gap between youth and elders, but also making it relevant to whatever topic you're talking about? Can you teach them, the reading component, that they can meet the standards at school, to the history of the land and what really occurred right there in their own communities? And so we hadn't talked about that yet, and I really wanted to emphasize that. I think there's a lot of opportunity for looking at cultural components, not just tribal, but within any culture.
Well, that's awesome. I want to close by thanking both of you for being the vanilla wafer that gets the innovation in the schools together. I'm going to use that metaphor, Dr. Pratt. I love it, because this world needs more connectors. This world needs more people who are getting people together and getting real solutions together. And I thank you both very much for your participation in this, but also for the work that you're doing every day on behalf of our students and our faculty and our communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Larta Institute and USDA NIFA thanks you for joining us for the 2021 Ed Games Expo and for tuning in to this discussion. We invite you to follow Larta Institute on LinkedIn or Twitter to connect with us and learn more about our next events. When leaving the session, please return to the main expo agenda to join the next event.
Well, there you have it, folks. Thank you for staying all the way to the end here. Like we said, we thank all of our speakers, and if any of them are still on the line, you're welcome to unmute yourself and share anything, but we do only have 4 minutes before the next live event over at the Department of Education's YouTube page, which we encourage everyone to go check out. I believe it's Musology, speaking on a very similar topic as this. Ayelet?
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today for this important discussion. As Christian mentioned, some of our panelists are here with us live today. Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to say a few words. You know, we only have a brief couple of minutes, but as on behalf of Larta Institute, we just wanted to thank everyone, the panelists, the companies. We wanted to thank Ed Metz for his involvement in the Department of Education, and it was a pleasure having this discussion, and we hope to continue having these discussions, these important discussions as we move forward. And thank you, everyone.
All right. Well, if we don't have any pressing questions or anyone wanting to join, please go to the YouTube channel for the Institute of Education Sciences. They will be premiering right now, I believe. There's already a waiting room over there.
And let's also thank USDA and Melinda Coffman, Caprice Young, and all the panelists who were with us, and all the presenters for their efforts in this regard. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you, Rohit, for kicking off the event.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Have a great rest of your evening.